Alright, we should be live now. Welcome to kind of our trial run of another kind of cast or design series here on the channel. We still need to come with a catchy name for it. If everyone has any suggestions, let us know in the comments. But joining me tonight is game designer Tomo and we are going to be trying to do something kind of as a follow-up to our cast talking about breaking down games design, and we're going to actually try and do it with some of the games that we've enjoyed over recent years. So, Tomo, how are you doing today?
Good. I'm glad to be here, and this sounds like a fun thing to get involved in, and I think something that maybe all of us should be doing more often. But I'm excited to be doing it more myself.
Mm-hmm. And I know that Tomo is kind of breaking up a little bit there. I think we're with the whole virusing going on now. I think bandwidth is being chewed up really bad. So this could either be the start of an ongoing series, or this could be the most expansive audio log for one of those video game apocalypses. We'll see. But for the format, each one of these episodes, we're going to spend about an hour, or maybe a little more, a little less, discussing the gameplay and game design of a title that both of us has played. And in the future, if there is interest and people want, maybe we can open this up to having guests and other people kind of join us for these little design examinations. So, as the title of this thumbnail, or the title of the thumbnail and the cast here, the first game that we've chosen is Slay the Spire. And this is one that was definitely one of my favorite games of last year. It was either last year or the year before that. Again, we're in a quarantine, so time really has no meaning for us now. But this is one of those games that, for me, when I started playing, like the very first build of it, I knew that this was going to be a really solid game. So, when you first started playing it, Tomo, what did you think of Slay the Spire?
Yeah. So I mean, personally, I don't often do much card-related game playing. But definitely I saw a lot of buddies playing the game quite a bit, and heard so many good things about it. And so when I did start playing it, very quickly came to start enjoying it quite a bit. And I think I had a lot of fun thoughts wrapped around the game.
Mm-hmm.
It really, because it's like you can think of it almost like as like a like a turn-based tactical game. It just makes this really clever use of the cards and emulates all the card-like gameplay mechanics that so many people enjoy, and then kind of setting it into the context of kind of like a single-player tactics game somehow.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think I really enjoy about, again, from our previous talk when we were trying to nail down elements of game design to look at, as we said, like for me, it comes down to kind of the UI, or kind of the control scheme, the core gameplay loop, and then where does this game go from here? And starting with the control scheme and the UI, I found to be a very elegant UI. As somebody who's played a lot of deck building style games, a lot of roguelike games, I thought they did a really great job of kind of being able to present all the information you really needed at any given time.
I totally agree. I mean, anything, you can think of it as a game. If you were to see it from the perspective of this kind of like turn-based tactical game with a single character against groups of enemies potentially, or enemies and groups of enemies,
Mm-hmm.
all the complexity that is captured with all those cards, you don't have any standard moves per se, right? The cards and their variety through the card interface allows you to have potentially an unlimited amount of moves and choices, but just the singular interface to kind of make use of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think what really helped the game is that, unlike a lot of like deck building style games or CCG style games, I think there's like, in the actual combat phase itself, there's no RNG. Like, every turn, okay, the enemy is going to be doing X amount of damage, I have X amount of energy. What can I do? What are my options within this context? And it made things, I think, a lot easier to compartmentalize. And I think it's something that a lot of other developers who are kind of going around this formula have been trying to copy from Slay the Spire now.
Well, there is something really from like a design standpoint. The more deterministic your game is, the less you have to kind of worry about unexpected intersections.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, I would say that Slay the Spire is a great example of a game whose unexpected intersections that can produce these outrageously overpowered results
Yes.
is definitely an integral part, though, of the design of the game.
Yeah, and as we just said, while there is no real RNG during the combat side of things, everywhere else, though, is kind of where that RNG comes into play and where the variance kind of builds up.
Oh yeah,
Because
the shuffling of a deck, and
mhm,
sometimes overwhelming, like screw jobs and or lucky, intersections.
yeah, and after every battle, you get the choice of a new card. You have the kind of, I'm not sure if it's really like a map or just kind of like a branching choice tree of what
Totally.
path you go down. And then, of course, there's the shop, your treasures, and like you said, this is one of those games where you can get that miracle run, or the game will just utterly screw you if you're in trouble there.
Well, and I think that, you know, the long-term experience with the game and and for the developer to take control of that long-term experience, I think that's a really good sign of kind of a mature design outlook.
Mm-hmm.
I think you'll find in a lot of cases, first time out, games will have something just fantastic about it. There's some great idea or some talent,
Mm-hmm.
um, but because of an inexperience, the greatness of the idea isn't kind of like naturally or comfortably spread out in the timeline. You've
Mm-hmm.
played those games where you have to kind of get through some pain to get to the good stuff, or the good stuff happens a bit soon and it doesn't get a chance to kind of play itself out over a long enough. You leave early going like, I wish I could gratify those mechanics more, or man, I'm glad I stuck with this game because now that I'm here, this stuff's amazing. And we've all felt that in different part, in different games. And sometimes it's just our own personal things that we like or dislike. But at the same time, I know from my own personal experience that it's really easy to kind of mess up what is a player going through over the course of, let's say, 50 hours of gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
That's a super hard to
Yeah.
guess those kinds of things, right? And so you need to start devising systems that kind of control and box in progress. It's like, well, I'm expecting you got to play with the ironclad guy. You're not really getting what you're supposed to do until you've played like 3 or 4 times. But somewhere in those 3 or 4 times, I want you to have gotten lucky and got further than you expect, so you get that rush. And like, it's easy to talk about our experience playing the game because we'll have gone through it, but building systems that aren't us talking, right, to make you feel that way, it's good stuff. And I was impressed. I was very much impressed with Slay the Spire.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's another really good point because we about like kind of like the first time developer because we've seen this again, especially like playing so many indie games here on the channel and just like in our day to day lives now, where the first game from a new developer or the first game of a new series usually has these rough patches to it. That it's not going to, that there's, it's a good game, but maybe there's something holding it back. Maybe it's developer inexperience. Maybe it's them just having to build a game at the same time they're designing it. Usually there's some kind of, sticking point there. And with Slay the Spire, like, really, I couldn't find anything that I would say, I would pull my finger down and say, they did this wrong, or, this could have been done better. And it's all the more amazing. I think this was the first time game from this company. I looked up Megacrit in the past, and I don't think they've made any other games before Slay the Spire.
Well, to be fair, when it comes to the design, right, it's the people that have designed the game and how much they've done before that,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and what opportunities did they have, what lessons did they learn? Because I mean, my own trajectory as a designer, I am built from the challenges and the order at which those challenges happened.
Mm-hmm. And like to your older point about kind of extrapolating what this game is going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 hours down the line, I thought they did a really great job of kind of avoiding that issue of like the new game plus, or how do I keep somebody who's already been the game interested in playing it. Because this is something that I think a lot of roguelikes tend to struggle with, is that if I beat your game, why do I want to play it again? If I got that miracle run, do I really want to play it again and, suffer for an hour or 2 hours to get another run like that? And the Ascension mode, I think, was just a brilliant implementation of that. I guess for you, like, how far did you make it down Ascension for Slay the Spire?
All right, so I have I've stated hours at 115, but I almost certainly just let the game run for a good amount of time. I've gotten very close to completing the fourth chapter, but have not. So I've not completed the largest possible run yet. For each of the characters, I've unlocked all of their unlocks except for the Watcher, which I have one unlock remaining. And I've completed though the 3 chapters, and it was actually probably a 50-hour discovery even that once you've completed with everything, that fourth chapter can become optional, like that the triangular keys that you start looking for. And I mean all of that, the whole sequencing and the pacing of all that sequencing I thought was really good, because it felt like every step you took, you got another big chunk of stuff to deal with, right? The 4 characters that you kind of like, you get a big chunk with the first, but before you're done with the first character, you probably start moving on to the second character, and then you feel like a little bit like you've been set back a bit, so then you go back and reinforce the first character, but that then carries you through to the second character, then to the third character, and then back to the second character, then back through all of them, then to the fourth character. At some point in that structure, you get past all 3, you finish the third act, and you're like, oh, it's like Infinity Blade. I'm supposed to die, and this runs forever kind of thing. But then you do it with all the characters, and then you see those keys show up, and you're like, oh, and it's like, I've been playing this game for a while, and I didn't even think that was necessarily going to be the thing. Oh, this is interesting, right? And now I start thinking about, wow, I need to be, and it's about that time too, which I found great, was I felt like I was starting to master the game. And I was only, I'm at like Ascension level 1 with Ironclad, 3 with Silent, 2 with Defect, and 1 with Watcher. So that kind of gives you a rough idea of where my progress is at. But I felt like, oh, I was getting this game, and maybe I'm done. Maybe I don't need to play this anymore. There's lots of games to play. But then that the carrot of just at least once completing the 4th act, I think was a fantastic motivator to kind of keep me in the game. At which point, if I got over that hump, who knows when the next hump is, right?
For me, checking Steam, I am at 125 hours play of the game, and a lot of that was during early access. This was one of those games, like I've said in the past, that I had to kind of restrict how much I would play in early access, or I may have burned out too much on it before 1.0 hit. I think that's what happened to me with Dead Cells. And I have been in the game, or at least I've been in Chapter 3 with the 3 main characters. I have not had a successful run with the Watcher. Yeah, the Watcher's the newest one, I think, right? The Defect is
the rightmost character.
Yeah. I have not had a successful run with her yet. I have been in Chapter 4 one and only one time, and I think that was with the Ironclad. I think it's been a while since I actually had that successful run. But in terms of Ascension, my highest was, I think, Ascension 10 or 11 with the Ironclad again. And yeah, that's...
You did a lot of blocking. A lot of... What's the one that looks like a tree trunk that does a ton of damage and it costs a lot of action points?
Oh, I forget the name of
Bludgeon.
Oh, yeah. I've been using a Juggernaut and the blocking to get like some very crazy synergies going there. And I won't definitely talk about card design and kind of gameplay in a second, but keeping with kind of the Ascension New Game Plus, for those of you who didn't play Slay the Spire, what they did was every time you beat the game, you unlock Ascension. And then the Ascension mode basically adds a different modifier that will affect the game. When you beat that and you go up another Ascension level, then it adds another modifier. And some of it's simple, like enemies do more damage. There's more elites on the field. But then I've seen people who get to like Ascension like 15, 20, and then they say, you are now forced to have a card in your deck that just takes up space.
Yeah, and those curses.
Yeah, and then it just gets harder and harder from there. And the thing about Slay the Spire, like any good roguelike, is that, and my phone is ringing, of course, as soon as I start talking, but like any good roguelike, it is very much, as we said, an RNG dependent game. You have to constantly pivot and adapt what the game throws at you. But at the lower difficulty levels, or before you even do Ascension, the player definitely kind of feels, I think, like they're in control a lot of the time. So if you get really good at the game, you should be able to win on normal difficulty, I would say, very often.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is I bet if you were to measure your actual rate at which you complete Chapter 3, you'll find that it's still pretty rare. It's just that so well, like when things are going wrong, that your brain kind of just shuts the memory off because it's no big deal. This is going to be a short, uninteresting, and if you've already unlocked everything, you don't even care. I mean, do you ever drop out of a game because it starts bad?
No, we just kind of refresh and try and go again.
Well, yeah, I just mean I shut this, I abandoned the run and then just jump right back in and try.
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, that start went to hell. And I mean, it is definitely plays very strongly into the fundamental core of the roguelike game structure, which is you win some, you lose some. What you're responsible for is hedging your bets when necessary and taking the right kinds of risks and going for it. And if you lose, you lose. Oh well. You're just gonna try again, and it's great for creating that feeling of you win some, you lose some.
And you are definitely going to be losing some. Oh, hello, Richie. Yeah, you are definitely going to be losing a lot in Slay the Spire. And it comes down to, I think, again, like that kind of black and white nature of deck building and CCG design. Cards don't have RNG to them. The cards are very explicit in what they do. If a card says it's going to do 10 points of damage, we don't need to run a mental calculation to determine how much damage it's going to do. But when you have the hard nature of the cards combined with kind of the fixed nature of the enemies, it can definitely lead to either some wild imbalances for either side. And like for me, like my bane in Slay the Spire, there's two fights in particular that when I see them, there's a good chance I'm going to lose. The first is the Time Eater boss in Chapter 3. As the boss... oh, my voice is dying. As the boss itself specifically is designed to hard counter rapid fire. I'm not sure what the actual definition of the strategy is. Like playing lots of cards per turn. Like, he will counter that strategy completely. And then there's that creature, I don't know if you ran into him, that you have to do damage to him to lower the amount of damage he's going to do. So
the kind of creepy, dark ghost thing.
Yeah, like when that guy shows up, I am dead. Oh, test. Oh, my headset went out. Okay. When he shows up, basically that means I don't draw any attack cards. So then he just gets like 5 free reign turns of doing like 80 points of damage.
Yeah, actually, that guy is interesting, right? If you employ a heavy block strategy, you are roasted.
Yep.
There's no way to get through that guy, and if you have to pivot when he shows up, now it's too late, right? It gives you this like it's weird. It's some of the, you don't feel it as frequently, but it is kind of a digital test. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, you did not get enough. You're too exposed in the number of attack cards available area, and so this enemy shows up, and now you lose because of it. So if you want more predictability, you need to hedge against that. But
Yep.
if you diversify too much, you're not strong enough in the one spot. You need to be to kind of propel you all the way through to the end. It's a
Yeah.
good it's a good balancing act, and it's the kind
Mm-hmm.
of balancing act that many players have a lot of difficulty perceiving as a balancing
Mm-hmm.
act. So it feels like an event. It feels dramatic. It's interesting. And then because it's so punishing, because especially that guy that you need to do damage to reduce how much he doesn't usually show up early in the game, right? He tends to
Yeah.
show up a little later in the game. And so like you remember when you die from him way harder and way less happy.
Oh yes. And like about deck building in Slay the Spire, that's another very interesting aspect. I think it's one thing that we don't really talk a lot about in these kinds of games is the kind of style or the theme of that deck building. Some games punish the player if their deck is too small, other ones punish if it's too big. And this seems to be a very major, I think, point that kind of differentiates these games from each other. And it's probably something we're going to be talking about a lot more because I don't know about you, but I've been getting a lot of emails and requests of developers who all have their own Slay the Spire like that they're developing at the moment. And
Oh, I mean, that doesn't surprise me
yeah.
because I mean, like you enjoyed it so much. I think so many people enjoyed it that it's like a virus in their heads.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying though, sorry.
What I was saying, so with Slay the Spire, this is a game that is clearly, as you said, is designed around figuring out what is going to be your strategy per run. And that is going to be based on what cards you get, what relics you find, and what you can buy at the shop. And I think this is another little subtle genius of the game, is that each class is very different in terms of what its potential strategies can be. The Silent is the burst heavy character. You can play a lot of shivs. You go for damage over time with poison. Ironclad is more about you can use defense, or it's about I'm only going to play one attack card, but that attack card is going to do like 5 to 10 times more damage than anything else the Silent has. And then of course the Defect and the Watch have their own unique little systems to them. And
Oh yeah.
it's very interesting about how these strategies develop because then those are further synergies with the relics. And what did you think about the relic design in Slay the Spire?
So, it's interesting. All of their systems are there to, like, none of their systems carries the burden of the whole game, right? There is no
Mm-hmm.
center and
Yeah.
then things around the center that grow and become less consequential as you get further from the core. It's more like there's three major systems that they all hand off the experience to each other in this almost kind of like jazz like rhythm. And I think the relic system is one of the easiest ones to find yourself like gaining all this expertise and knowledge in, but not necessarily actively strategizing around it, right? You're just like, it's in some ways you could say it's the shape of the level. It's the random level generation is just as much the rate and the specific relics you get
Mm-hmm.
as the actual nodes on the kind of progression map. In fact, the nodes on the progression map aren't really level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the level I'm in maybe says now that I should definitely be using more power cards because they generate blah blah blah. Like if it's going to be the defect, like I using a power cards, I'll get more orbs or something, or I automatically start with the frozen orb, and that's now in this particular playthrough, I just got to be thinking. I'm thinking more defensively because of that, right? It's the territory or the terrain that you're operating on. So I found that system, and that it's unexpected that it be the thing that you're responding to, right? Because I can't,
Mm-hmm.
you can. It's absolutely essential to know what relics you are going to buy and saving up the gold you have for buying relics in those shops. That's one of the most, I think, important pieces of the thought process. Even though my favorite thing in the world is just to buy up a crap load of cards from those shops. And especially like the non-denominational cards, because they think, I mean, partly because they're fresh in my head, because you get so used to the particular character's cards when you get to explore
Mm-hmm.
the non the what are they called? They're called like
Colorless.
colorless
Yeah.
cards. Yeah. It gives you like a twist in the gameplay,
Mm-hmm.
but the relics, they really dictate, and it's really the right configuration of relics more
Mm-hmm.
than anything, I feel like, are what propel you to being able to kind of complete a given run.
Definitely. And for people watching us right now who don't know what we're talking about, with Slay the Spire, there's two kinds of cards in the game. You have the colored cards, and the color is denoted by each of the classes. So the Ironclad gets red, Silent gets green, Tifa gets blue, and I don't know what the Watcher gets. I haven't played around enough with her. But you
Purple.
can. Oh, is that?
Purple.
Okay, got it. And the colorless cards are kind of like the generic or the general cards that anybody can use, and they typically have more like esoteric abilities. Like they can do some crazy things. One of the ones that I really liked was it's a power. I forget the name of it, but it basically will play the top card in your deck for free every turn. So it just basically gives you one free card every turn once you play that power.
Yeah, and you could think of it as like a free action point. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really powerful card, and those cards, like the way they can work together, gets really crazy. It's like you're like some of that stuff where it's like if you play a power card, then you get this other powerful effect to occur, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
like the top card on the deck gets played every turn, which
Mm-hmm.
means now every turn, let's say the distribution is, 1 out of 4 cards is a power card, or 1 out of 5 cards is a power card. Now 1 out of 5 turns, you get a free starting the turn with that effect connected to that artifact, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's like crazy combinations. In many cases, combinations. What I like the feeling of is the first time you find these combinations and they actually play themselves out, because there's kind of 2 ways to do this, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really even remember it because it's too complicated. It kind of has to happen a couple times before you start going like, oh, I really like this combination, and then you start thinking about, well, how can I cultivate the conditions that are supportive of that situation
Yeah.
if it should occur? And then your brain starts just building all these scenarios. It's like, well, at the same time, I might like it if I was able to craft this other scenario as well. So I wouldn't want to cut my chances out for that. Or it's like the Necronomicon book thing, right? You're like, every
Mm-hmm.
time you see that book thing where you're like, God, I'm glad I keep my hit points up because I'm going to burn through them no matter what. I got to take those 10 hit points. I got to get that book.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, darn it, it's not Necronomicon.
Yeah.
To be fair, if you never store 2-point attack cards, Necronomicon's totally worthless.
Mm-hmm.
And then next thing you know, you're starting to store 2-point attack cards, and then it doesn't show up, and you're like, see, I never spend them because two's kind of expensive, and it's not really working out for me to use them when I get to automatically spend it for free, because spending it for free is enormously powerful, right?
Oh yes.
Whereas filling your deck with 2-point cards that you can't spend for free is devastating to your effectiveness.
Yeah. A really good example of that kind of like having that perfect build kind of coalesce is the I forget the name. I think it's called the exhaust branch or whatever the name of it. It's a relic that every time a card gets exhausted, it gives you another card for free.
Yeah.
And so you think to yourself, that sounds horrible. Why do I want to get rid of my own cards? This relic just seems like a dead relic. And then you play with the Silent with a Shiv based strategy, who every time she throws a Shiv, that card exhausts. So all of
Yeah.
a sudden, I spawn 3 cards, I play those Shivs, I now get 3 free cards out of a 0 cost card, and then you get the power that lets her draw or gets free Shivs per turn, and then all of a sudden, or it just again it just spirals out of control like that. And it's not, again, something like you said, that you can, like, the first time it happens, you can't prepare for it because you didn't even know that was a prospect for that character.
Oh, and even getting to being able to understand that play pattern requires a lot of investment in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And to be fair, it's not that it's painful investment. It's a natural byproduct. Every step that comes before it required the step that came before it, but the step that came before it was an interesting outgrowth of the step before that came before that, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not, and at the same time, it's not a linear line of those steps, right? It's like a field of those steps, and that there's all these points in the kind of the matrix of, or the spreadsheet of all these opportunities. All of them are interesting, and all of them have more or less strong connections to the next thing you'll think about after you've learned how this works.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if we want to kind of take a step back and kind of start talking about kind of like the larger structure of the game, right? There's this whole beginning thing where you got the normal game versus the daily climb, and we're just going to shelve daily climb, right? Daily climb, by the way, is you've mastered the game, or you've gotten all of the understanding of the game
Mm-hmm.
going. most of it, let's say, and now Daily Climb allows you to kind of repeat and puzzle solve in more constrained environment.
Mm-hmm.
Still very interesting, but it's if you're not reasonably well experienced in the game, it's not terribly different from the normal game. So it's not like a huge experiential difference. Other than you might get, you'll get to see your rating on a leaderboard, which will look conventionally far down the leaderboard if you're not really, deeply into the game at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But you get to pick amongst the 4 characters, and the 4 characters very much explore exploiting certain axes in the fundamental set of the game rules, right? Obviously, like the Ironclad is about trying to kind of like either. I mean, this is putting it too simplistically, and there's probably room for pages and pages of analysis, kind of like at the pure game design level, but.
Mm-hmm.
Going to town with massive defense or massive attack, and obviously mostly a combination of those two, but using the conventional rules and just turning their volume up and up and up to kind of get better and better results, and a certain amount of I'm okay taking damage, right? There's a certain kind of healing component to the way Ironclad works. Well, between map healing, right? At least that's its basic ability.
Yeah.
But like you were talking about silence, like it scales how many cards can I play in a given turn, right? And for silent, you would never want to take that that disadvantage for the extra power thing that limits the amount of cards you could play.
Oh yes, definitely.
You would never choose that for the silent, right? In fact, you might learn that by having chosen that for the Ironclad because you tend to play fewer cards. Going, I love that. I always pick that. And then you start playing silent. You're like, I should. Oh my God, I'm so hamstrung by choosing that relic. I'll never do that again.
Yeah, and it's very clever about how the different characters kind of, as you said, embody different strategies or different potentials. Because there are some relics that, for the right class, it's game breaking to get it. For other classes, it's like, what the hell did I just do to myself?
Yeah.
Like I said, one of my favorite things for the Ironclad is to get defense combined with the Juggernaut card. And I think the Juggernaut card basically, every time you get defense, you do damage to an enemy. So you can get cards, you can get like an attack card that gives you defense, get defense at the end of the turn, and then you can get the card that lets you preserve your defense. And then you just become an unblockable wall that just does damage just by not even, you don't even need to hurt anybody, you're just hurting them by default.
Well, now it's like you're just piling defense cards onto your character endlessly, right? And before you know it, like some of those numbers can get way out of control.
yes.
Oh, and by the way, Rich is co-founder of Hyperkinetic Studios.
Nice. Everyone's taking time off.
Yeah.
See you later, Richie. Be sure to check out our Discord if you have a chance too, down below. I guess
so. If you think about it, though, the silent also has poison. So poison is this damage over time way to apply damage, which I think is really, really like a fun, attractive thing. Like I stuck with silent probably more than any others because I just started getting addicted to trying to get the biggest poison take possible on a boss.
And then don't forget about Corpse Bomb, which then, or Corpse Explosion, that then does damage equal to the poison on one enemy to all the other enemies.
Yeah. And I think I got an achievement for some humongous number on that.
Yeah. So who is your overall favorite class?
So I think my favorite class is the defect, but the one that I've had the most success with is the silent.
Yeah.
And I left behind the Ironclad fairly early on, and I've been coming back to it just because I want to get the Ascension level up. I'm not all the way through figuring out the Watcher. And if we kind of keep talking about these classes, like the defect scales into those orbs, but it's really a power card playing class, right?
Yes.
Power cards start modifying how those orbs can work, and then that starts becoming its own form of kind of like runaway power scaling. Where you start feeling like I'm invincible, which turns out sometimes being invincible is just enough to get to the end, right?
Yeah.
I mean, neat thing about this game is there are many times you're like, I got this run. I'm so powerful, and then you just hit something that you're not suited for, and you're like,
like that ghost guy from Earl I mentioned. Every time he shows up, I just know, yep, this run's over, folks. See you later.
Well, I mean, it took me some time in the early game just to even cope with that elite. That's the big, tall red guy with the big club.
Oh, yes.
You need to get in his face. You need to stop trying to defend yourself, right? You just need to pile the attacks on and drill him down as hard as you can. And if you use too many defensive, or if you use too many skills, basically, right, that hit just gets scaled up.
He just
too
knocks.
much.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the defect is very interesting because when I first started playing with him, I liked him, and then I started to like him less. I started to lose a lot more. As you said, like, the defect is only the ramping strategy. Like, he's that character that if you get the right power cards, he's unstoppable. If you don't get those cards, like, he seems like one of those, like, he can do everything and anything, but not good enough as a jack of all trades kind of character.
Yeah, ultimately, you still have to kind of somehow balance between whether you're going to be defense heavy or if you're going to be damage application heavy. There aren't really any valid strategies for too much action points because at some point you're just burning through a bunch of like you run out of cards that you can run draw. You can have too many like, you can have too much action power points, right? And if you have too many action points, then you definitely don't want to have that many. You don't want to have plasma orbs floating around. But in terms of like the damage thing too, right? It's like that choice between whether you're just going to have like that rotating set of orbs that just keep dropping lightning on everybody over and over, and you get that really satisfying like they did something to me, but because of my power card configuration, all this stuff happened on screen and they were all gone.
Yes. And like we said, like, that kind of ramping, like, it's always a really great kind of a power curve in games like this, and it's something that we see in, I think, a lot of other like deck building style games where, you know, if the machine all works in unison, you can just basically sit back and let the game play itself and you win. But it's figuring that out that can often be the hardest point.
When, you know, something about Slay the Spire, I mean, I think many games share this, I guess, but it's deck building in the flow of the gameplay experience, right? It's like the roguelike effect is the building of the deck. And then I'm going to rebuild the deck. And because of the roguelike kind of conceptual pattern being applied to the accessibility of those cards, it's my incremental choice of card, like my leaning, my preferences, right, that start building my deck for the second boss and for the third boss and potentially for the fourth boss. And then I'm polishing my kind of like, well, this is the beginning of the game. I need to pick something that increases my block because I'm just not going to have enough defense through towards the end. Any of the elites in this first round are just going to tear me up if I don't get more defense with the way I usually approach things. Or you might be thinking about something else. You're like, I'm going to take risks. I'm going to always choose this particular vein of attack card or power card. It's not going to help me in the short term, but I need to make those choices in the short term in case I can get good things going on in the second, but you know, in the second area. And if things don't work out, I just ditch the playthrough. Yeah, I ran into the wrong enemy. This wasn't the playthrough for me. And people can have totally different approaches. I feel like I split my approach to the game. First half was very much, I'm going to make this run work, right? And no matter what's happening, I'm going to do my best attempt at surviving. But then after you've kind of, you know, after you've unlocked a bunch of stuff and after you've won a few times, getting to the end isn't nearly as exciting as trying to explore various strategies. So now it's like, now I'm trying things out. Now I'm taking risks, but I'm taking risks at the meta incremental selection level, right? I mean, in fact, strangely enough, in the context of Slay the Spire, it's not really fun to take risks in the particular card plays. Because you were saying it's all deterministic, but there are some random elements, right? The selection of which enemy will take damage when it's a random enemy that will take damage. And then like the what's it when you get rid of a card? What's the word they use? Exhaust. Yeah. The exhausting of a random card in your hand. Those two are powerful random effects.
Yes.
Which can either play very much to your benefit, or if you weren't paying attention, man, the exhausting a random card has screwed me over many a time, actually.
And I think, well, you said there was a really good point about once you be in the game, like that first initial time you play it, your purpose is to beat the game. You want to see the ending. But once you've done that, then it becomes about, okay, what else does this game have? You know, the allure of winning is done. Let's start exploring. And I think, like myself, like I did some very, I started to play around more with some of those crazy events. Like the one that always like really knocks me for a loop is when you can get the I forget the name of the card. It's the one that it lowers your, or the event, it lowers your health by half, and then you get these cards that give you one free turn on invulnerability. But if you don't
Oh
play the
yes,
card, it
it
exhausts unless you
exhausts.
upgrade
Yes,
it. And
it
like
makes. I love that. It's good.
like my one friend was like, I love that event. I take it every time. And I'm like, how the hell do you do that? Like, it's so much of a risk there to take that one card or that one event.
Well, you are very powerful though, because
Mm-hmm.
in fact, what it is it kind of it increases the stakes and
Mm-hmm.
makes you quite powerful against very powerful enemies, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
enemies that do a whole bunch of damage now do 1 point of damage.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get any amount of block, like those relics that'll give you like 1 point of block or 4 points of block at the beginning of a turn, now you're really invincible. I mean, even
Mm-hmm.
if it's like a bunch of those birds pecking at you with
Ugh.
all these attacks, it's still not that much damage. It's it's let me see if I can try to get into some of more of like the structural stuff I was kind of like meaning to talk about here. Like when I was saying that there are multiple systems that all hand off to each other, kind of the most important thing that's going on at any given point. Something about that structure makes it unstable. And what's nice about unstable in that regard is that you have difficulty remembering its details. I don't know why this moment was so successful, and part of that is because the relic system took like 1/3 of the burden of contributing to this interesting situation. Your card selection over the course of the last 12 battles took up another third, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can call that your kind of deck building strategy, which is constrained by some amount of randomness. Um, and then adding to that, just like I could have picked a particular class would have like another effect. And then whether I chose to, what my to kind of the lesser degrees, like my gold spending habits, whether I choose to rest versus forge the card for improvements, which is an potentially enormously powerful choice, depending, right?
Yep.
That all those things, they all have an important role to play, but because they're all kind of separate systems that kind of take their own moment with it, I have, a player will have difficulty kind of recalling all those pieces in that path. And it makes it so that it, in no way does that invalidate the coolness of your experience, but it means you have to do it more to get like kind of really consciously aware of how all the pieces fit together. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of it's complexity that its complexity hides the path that you took, I guess, but in
Mm-hmm.
a way that's not it's not negative.
Yeah. And like you said, like there's never one system in Slay the Spire that kind of dominates the conversation. It's all these aspects that come together to kind of add to the core gameplay, which in this game is obviously going to be the combat and kind of the deck building side of things. But as you said, then we have the relics, then we have the shop, we have the rewards, and it's just a very elegant way of putting this all together. And going back to what you said a few minutes ago that I wanted to elaborate on, the fact that the deck building itself is part of the roguelike structure, I think gives it a really different feel compared to what we call a traditional CCG or a traditional deck builder. Because, again, for anyone here who plays any kind of deck building style games, the deck building is always done beforehand. You can spend minutes or hours at a time constructing your favorite 20, 30, 40 card deck, and then the randomness comes into play as to, what your opponent's going to do. With Slay the Spire, you have no idea what your deck is going to turn out. And I think for me, I think that's kind of why I gravitated towards Slay the Spire and these other kind of roguelike deck builders more than like kind of the traditional CCG. Because in a traditional CCG, it kind of feels like, I know, Shaw, you've never played one. I know you're never thinking about designing one either. There, in a traditional deck builder, once I build that deck, it's kind of like that's it. That system is done. Like, unless I get a new card, or unless, I get some lucky roll in the booster pack or loot box, that deck is solidified. This is my baby, and now I'm going to take it win, lose, or draw into how many matches I want. With Slay the Spire, it's, as you said, it's incremental. I don't know what's going to happen at the end of this turn or at the end of this match. I could get some amazing card that all of a sudden it synergizes with this one relic that I got that, I thought that relic was just going to be a dead choice this round or this playthrough. But now, all of a sudden, these pieces are coming together. Just like I could get some really weird card that's like, it's a really great card, but it has nothing to do with my synergy. But
Yeah.
do I want that card just because of the sheer utility of it?
Well, it's interesting. If you get the effect that reduces the number of cards you get to choose from,
Yes.
you really can feel how your ability to kind of start kind of charting your path through the potential power space of the character gets heavily constrained. And now you're not making any choices. You just have to deal with it, and it's random, right? It's like,
Yes.
if I had 20 random cards, that is vastly weaker generally. On average, it'll be way weaker than 60 cards that I got to pick 20 cards out of. And in groups of 3, or the opposite being when it moves up to, you can choose amongst 4. It's 4. I think you can up the card by 1, so you can choose from 4. That it gives you more flexibility. It is like a 33% boost in potential power on a per choice of card basis, right?
Yeah.
In fact, it might be that one moment, right? That maybe the way I'd like to describe like the core gameplay loop is that your deck gets challenged by a fight, and if you pass the test, you're allowed to increase the size of your deck by 1.
And again, with something like Slay the Spire, is very much designed around kind of like the lean strategy, because of the fact that if you run out of cards, your deck just immediately reshuffles it. I've played other deck builders where you run out of cards, it's game over, or you're being punished for it. So here, if you have, like, I've seen people like shockingly win with like 5 or like 3 card decks. These are the 3 perfect cards that work together. That's all I play, and I will win every match.
So those players love that when the remove a card from your deck thing gets cheaper. I got to explore that more. I'm
Yes.
generally a sloppy as hell gigantic deck kind of player, but I think it's partly because I've only gotten as far as I've gotten in the game. Because I am on the horizon to explore the minimalistic decks.
Yeah, like, I don't think I've ever had a deck drop below 15 cards. I don't think I've ever been able to do that, because again, there's always that like voice in the back of my head that's like, but what if you need this card? It's such a good card. You can't throw that card out just because it'll make your deck leaner. And here's the question for you then. When you get that event that either lets you like pick set cards from a choice, or just get like more random cards. Like, that's always like one of like those like killer choices when it pops up as an event.
Yeah. I mean, I am generally choosing in those situations. If I get to keep the multiple cards, I'll tend to just go for it, because I'm such a like big deck type of player, and I like always lean on the types of options that allow like larger decks to gain a benefit. I mean, I like those cards where it's like you'll do as much. Mind Blast, is it right? You do as much damage as how many cards you have in your deck, and I think I've seen that get up to like 30.
And
then it becomes latent, right, or whatever they call it, inherent, or what's the word when it's
it begins with I think it's either latent or inherent, one of those two.
Yeah. So you start every match off doing 30 points of damage, and you're like, this feels good.
Or like with the sun, you can make the Shiv spawning cards lay in as well. So just start every round, I get 5 free Shivs.
Click drag, click drag, click drag, click drag, click.
Yes. And one thing that we didn't touch on, I think, is a very other important aspect of this game. We kind of mentioned earlier was energy costs, because that's another very big thing. It's another one of those aspects that's unique to deck building. That when you're trying to balance cards or build them, it's not only about the effect of the card, but also the cost itself. And Slay the Spire, again, is very interesting in that regard because it has everywhere from 0 cost cards to like 5 or 6 to even the X cards, where
Yeah,
it will do an
yes.
effect based on the amount of energy you have in your pool. And I think, as anyone who's played the Slay the Spire knows, no matter how much energy you have, it's never enough when you're playing this game.
Well, you can get overdone. I mean, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
some of the times I've played with the defect, I have more action points than I need for too much. I made a mistake, right? I
Mm-hmm.
kind of overblew my energy, and it wasn't benefiting me. Although that's another thing that can happen too if you get too much cursing going on, or if you get those enemies that just
Mm-hmm.
flood your deck with garbage,
Mm.
and suddenly you're like, I'm invincible, and it's like, oh my god, I'm
I
gonna
can't
lose.
play anything. Yeah.
That's the end of this playthrough. Darn it, I really didn't consider that threat well enough.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's very interesting because then, as we said, I think again, like kind of like our main point for what makes Slay the Spire work is how all these systems integrate with each other. You then have relics and other cards that can affect the cost of cards or affect how they play out. And yeah, there's a lot of 0 cost cards in the game. I'm trying to, again, it's been a while since I played the game, but I know there are cards that can. I think the Ironclad gets a card that reduces the cost of all cards in their hand by 0, or reduces it to 0. But once you play that card, it's usually a 3 cost card, so you can't play anything else. But
Oh well, yeah, I like that one's a fun one to play with too because it's kind of an all or nothing kind of situation, and you're like, oh my, I need to put this defensive card in there, because it'll tend to do stuff like all attack cards or all power cards or all skill cards that get dropped to 0. But yeah, that's good. It's fun.
And speaking about energy, I definitely want to ask your thoughts on this one. What do you think about the energy upgrading aspect of Slay the Spire, specifically by the fact that the majority of the relics that give you energy take something away from you? And I thought that was both an ingenious and just very devious way of like tempting the player, because as we said, 1 point of energy can mean all the difference in the world. But it always is kind of like that, like the devil's bargain. Do you really need that 1 point of energy if it could maybe boost the attack of every enemy that you fight going forward, or remove
Yeah,
your ability to rest or forge more cards?
removing the ability to rest is brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, certainly, like, I did make use of the enemies get +1 strength for a long time, but I think in a hidden sort of way, it's not. It's still kind of a little bit problematic.
Mm.
Um, never ever get gold again is another rough one.
Oh yes,
I mean,
and
the interesting thing is, like, if you like 0 point cards, right? Because there's an action point scaling element, but then there's also, like we were just discussing, there's a cost of card
mm-hmm.
scaling element too, right? And so if you can bring the cost of cards down, especially to 0, then you don't need the action points. But
Mm-hmm.
having one more action point allows you to take some of those basic cards, which cost 1 point, and do another action in the turn. And if you're accustomed to those 3, it going to 4 is gigantic. And once in a while, you get used to it, can get up to 5. And let's say it gets up to 5, and I have a plasma orb. I have 5
Oh yeah.
orbs, maybe I have 2 of them, and I have 7 every turn. And then
Mm-hmm.
you're using those things where you cash it in, and you get you get as much energy as you have skill
Mm-hmm.
cards in your deck or something like that, right? It's like you get so much energy unless you can be drawing new cards, which is another scalar, right? Kind of
Mm-hmm.
like the silence superpower is how many extra cards can I draw?
Or the
Um,
unending top, when you get that route,
yeah,
it just infinitely draws cards as long as you keep going. As long as you keep playing your whole hand, it keeps drawing more cards.
yeah, and like is I'm sure there's an achievement for playing through the total number of cards you have in your deck in a single hand or something, in a single turn or something, and that it's totally possible, right? That the high end results are they use up all the available dynamic range, right? It's this the poison can get into the hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
I can get 5 orbs with +6 affinity or something, and every time I take damage,
They
it
all.
it uses an orb and does damage to everybody. But then every time I damage them, it does damage to me again, which then does it again, and you just see those orbs like
Yeah.
rotating around and causing all this insanity. It's a really great expression of exponential results,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something I'm always on the lookout for in any kind of games design or any experiences design. Right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
we like it if something happens. 0 to 1 is good, and 0 to 1s kind of represent the continuum of our experience, and that the kind of flavor of that something happened, something happened has to be good. It has to be in the vein of something that we like, right? And if
Yeah.
that goes on, we're cool with that. But if something happening is good, then obviously sometimes a double the effect happening is kind of good because that's two of those things. But we often lose sight of how good going from 1 to 2 is, because then we go with going from 2 to 3, and 2 to 3 is not as good as going from 1 to 2.
Mm-hmm.
It's better if it goes from 1 2 then to 4, and then 4 go to 8, right? And 8 go to 16, and 16 go to 32. And
Mm-hmm.
when you see that expressed in the game, for me, usually it's a good indication that these people are mindful of, have an accurately mindful of the way people experience things and have a good time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know time-wise we are just about at the hour. I have
Yeah.
two more topics I want to bring up about Slay the Spire, and then I think
All right.
that does it for me. If you have anything you want to bring up, definitely feel free. Um, Before we get to that, I just thought of one other thing. What did you think of the Snecko effect? The one that randomly changes the energy values of cards. Like, to me, that's the one thing that I have friends who take that and they love it, or the one that removes your ability to see the enemy predictions. Like, those two things, like, my mind would break if I try to make use of that in a strategy.
Yeah, I have not explored them because I am a little resistant to it. And I know that big, tall, like weird lizard thing that
Mm,
immediately creates randomization of
yeah.
your cards cost, that will throw my strategies into disarray
Yes.
almost every time. I mean, I'm a little bit better about it, like kind of towards the tail end, because I've slowed down on the game maybe about like 5 6 weeks ago or something like yeah, something like that. That was about the time I was starting to get better at coping with the randomized costs of things, and I never did it. I would never do it on purpose,
Mm-hmm.
um, unless I could like win the match, and then not have to deal with it basically.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of like not seeing what the enemy's going to do, that's really tough. I
Yeah.
mean, to be fair, I am starting to get to the point where I kind of know what they're going to do because of having seen the patterns so many times. And I mean, obviously, I think we're identifying it as a little bit more of like a pro or expert technique, right?
Yeah.
That if it was purely you get no certainty as to what the enemy's doing, then it's probably too damaging a choice. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't randomize what enemies do. It just takes away visibility on the information you've always been looking at. And so it's a good, in a weird way, it's kind of a good, it's as it if you have everyone's behaviors and their
Mm-hmm.
sequence memorized, then it's not a cost, right? So
Yeah.
you get free power out of that. But I'm sure between me and you, we sit there and we stare at what those guys are going to do, and then
Yeah.
we look at our cards and we stare at what those
Yeah,
guys are going to
that
do. We look at our cards.
yeah, that just again it just breaks me. Like I could not play the game like that.
But
Uh,
from a design perspective, it's a great expert's tool. It
mm-hmm.
also means that the people that have played the game so much and or have more quickly memorized the sequence of behaviors that enemies do, or internalized their kind of their AI rhythms,
Mm-hmm.
they get free power if they make that choice,
Yeah.
because they lose nothing by having that information hidden, and then they get the benefits of whatever that choice is. I'm just not quite there yet, but I can easily spot that as an elegant choice for the designers to allow
Mm-hmm.
you to get one more unit of power that an earlier or a less experienced player would tend not to choose.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of cool in that regard. The
Mm-hmm.
randomizing of the costs, that's just a bit too Joker, or what's the name of the Discord from My Little Pony? It's a bit too much like that kind of a character's like insane asylum approach to the game. And I'm sure if I sat down and analyzed it, I'd find what the cost benefit analysis should be, or
Mm-hmm.
results would be. But
Yeah.
I definitely am not there yet as a player of that game.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about more about the enemies, the other point I wanted to bring up is what did you think about the overall enemy design of Slay the Spire? We've talked about this kind of previously or earlier about they are very much again designed about the same kind of deterministic aspects of the cards. Like there are enemies who will flat out counter specific strategies. One of the other ones I hate are those like three blob like creatures who show up in the third biome that when they die, if any one of the other two are still alive, they come back to life with I think a quarter of their health. And it's important for people watching us right now. The enemies in Slay the Spire, they are not randomized. They're going to behave the same way every time. Every encounter is fixed, but you don't know who you're going to run into on an event or when they're going to show up in a biome.
Yeah, I think the way I'd like to look at those enemies, right? If you take the concept, like the narrative is that you get in a fight with them and you beat them up till they die or you die. But from a kind of a technical kind of standpoint, the enemies are basically like just a data structure that is disassembled better with one strategy or another, and also disassembles you in a way that can be resisted in one way or another. And so you can kind of think of each enemy as challenging you to survive, and whether or not your existing deck has that capability. And of course, if you're and it's that scales though, right? Either I can make it so you have no effect on me, and it feels good when you get in a fight and you take basically no damage, um, or heal it all up, which both those are indistinguishable. And then at the same time, they have a certain way in which they take damage that if you're not capable of doing, you're at more or less of a disadvantage as well. So it kind of takes your attack strategies and your damage mitigation strategies and puts them to a test. If you built your deck in a way that is in alignment with those challenges, then you get to overcome the challenge. And so their enemies are really, honestly, very carefully constructed to match all these different profiles of decks and how they're built. And I bet you we could even, if we went back there and analyzed it, I bet you might even find that some of the early enemies when you play with character A are the later enemies when you play with character B. That you won't get that like conventional weird fat lizard monster that occasionally gets armor that you see at the beginning of every Ironclad fight. That probably doesn't show up at the same time as with like the Watcher or whatever. I mean, I'm not sure about that. I'd just be a guess if I was making the game. I'd be like, let's take this is exactly what you need to learn as the Ironclad. So we're always sticking that in right at the beginning, or at least this one or this one, because it matches the profile of like the starting deck for Ironclad. Yeah. Which you can subvert a bit if you do that thing where you ditch your first artifact to get something else, but you're still playing a bit of a random game, right? Now, the later enemies, especially the elites, they start creating like not only do you need to have a particular deck with capabilities, you also need to know like kind of in some cases exactly how to use your tools. Like, yeah, you may be very capable of defeating the guy, the big red guy that'll do more damage to you if you use skills, but if you use those skills, then you lose. You need to, in the context of your deck, your style of using cards now gets shifted one way or another depending on those enemies. And each of those enemies, you can really analyze them for what decks they want you to have. And then you can also start thinking, and it's not like specific cards necessarily, right? It's a particular balance between defense and attack and number of actions, creating vulnerabilities, being able to slough off a debuff. All those things kind of come together to make at least a reasonably complex set of choices for the player. Yep. And so that's it's just yet another example of something very elegant that the game put together.
And I didn't think about that with them changing kind of where certain enemies will show up in a given biome based on the card strategy, because that's a very fascinating idea if they did something along those lines. Because like we've said, with the enemies being almost as deterministic as the cards themselves, certain characters obviously have very strong or weak strategies based on what they show up. Like as we said, like the Ironclad is really good at one strong punch of damage, but isn't that good, at least at the start, if you have to fight 3 or 4 weaker enemies and you're trying to spread that damage around. There's another encounter that wrecks me a lot. It's when you get like those 4 or 5 little enemies near the end of Biome 1, and like one of them can debuff you, another one can explode, another one provides shields, and like basically if they start ramping like that, the run kind of dies right there. And
totally. Well, I've had some trouble with those birds.
Yeah.
I just didn't quite realize that the multiple 1-point attacks there's some advantages to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now there's obvious straightforward counters, and then there's the other side of it of doing 3 points of three separate attacks worth of damage to one will disable it, right?
Yeah.
And also bring it to its ground state where it'll take full damage after. And so it's like those little things are just, they kind of create different permutations on how you have to approach them, and you get to learn that in the process, right? They'll kill you the
Mm-hmm.
first time, or
Mm-hmm.
well, they'll kill some characters the first time, right? Like those
uh,
three characters that just look like kind of like hunched over witch-like characters.
yeah.
They do decent damage. They have decent amount of hit points. Solid, straightforward fight in some cases, but it's kind of sucky if you're not rigged up for enough defense, right? It's like, I don't have enough block
Mm-hmm.
to kind of get through this. So if I'm not disabling one of them, or if I can't put one down really fast, there's all these. I have to either use some tricks, or I need to be very robust in my defense. But if I go too far in defense, then
Mm-hmm.
those guys I need to do a bunch of damage to will totally wreck me.
Mm-hmm.
It's good stuff, solid stuff, and that any one approach will find a different enemy problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff.
And again, it gets back to the whole dynamic of a lean versus a fat deck. Your lean deck may be the perfect counter to this one group, but it can lead to you utterly failing another group.
Yeah.
That one enemy in the second biome who likes to shield itself and then recovers its shield every like 4 or 5 turns. That's a fight that's either hell, or again, if you have a shield breaker, I think the defect gets that, the melter.
Yeah.
It nullifies that entire fight, but again, if you don't get that card, oh no, I'm in very big trouble.
Well, and that also, I found that the poison stuff is really great way to get through those guys, right? You
Mm-hmm.
just like, I'm never gonna get through that armor, but you're gonna be dead in a couple turns,
Yep.
and now I can spend all this energy defending myself.
Yeah, and final point about enemy design, then I'll move on to my final topic. One thing that I thought was very fascinating from like an overall design standpoint is that they really have not added in a lot of new enemies since Slay the Spire, since it went to 1.0 and beyond. They've added in, new cards, new relics, and of course the Watcher, but you would think, like from the outside, that they could just, we're just going to throw in 15 new enemies who can show up in the game. But again, with this kind of theme of everything coalescing, you can't just throw in one new enemy because that can completely wreck not only the balance of the game itself, but you have to make sure it's balanced for every different class that's in your game right now.
So I would theorize that even though we have the four classes really explore the underlying features just in kind of like harder or less hard.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say there's like four-ish main axes or so, like the action point versus card cost axis, the do damage versus the do block stuff, and certain power, because you can think of, well, I don't know exactly how to itemize the four right now off the cuff, but the defect, for example, just by using those orbs is just kind of exploring a power card structure, which is, so far as I can tell, very similar for the Watcher class. It's just that the stances just aren't. It's not as much of like a let me get a portfolio of orbs and start rotating through them. Rather, when do I time shifts from state A to state B to state super or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of like turns the defects gameplay on its side. Whereas the difference between like the Ironclad and the Silent is that Ironclad plays more of the apparent surface level mechanics of using attack cards and defense cards, and Silent, I mean, has poison, but poison's kind of, think of poison as just like a modulation on the way they can do damage. It's really that weird, I can use way more cards, right? And I would say that defect plays a little more with action points than maybe some of the other classes do, although everyone can play with it a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Each class can take a part of the game and turn it all the way to its maximum,
Mm-hmm.
and that becomes at least an option in your deck building strategy. But all of that is born out of deck building strategies, of which I think there are a limited set. There are
Yes.
certain kind of like primary shapes to the decks that you create, and the enemies are constructed to counter or be weak against those. And so unless a new shape for the decks were to emerge, there's no need to create new enemies. So
Mm-hmm.
if they did add enemies, my guess would be that they are just functionally identical to other enemies, and they were just there to add like skin variety or something. But that's not
Yeah.
necessarily a good design choice. And so in a lot of ways, that's great of them. They added a character that remixes the defect. They might add more cards, but they're just slight variations on existing cards because I can only add one card at a time. So if I have an A+1, B-1 card, and C10, that I could have a C10, A-1, B+1 card, basically.
Yeah.
Those were two different things I said. And now it's like just a minor, it's like a lean left version of what used to be the lean right version. And that's a valid thing to add because maybe I want my whole deck to skew a little bit towards that other valid, larger deck shape. And so I think it makes actually a good deal of sense that they didn't add any enemies because it's unnecessary.
Yeah. And like you said, with like how these characters function, it's not a case where one class can do everything. That's not how it works. Like I would say maybe two, possibly pushing like three different builds per class seems to be kind of like what they're going for in terms of their design. And like you said, it in some cases it's very big changes. You know, like the defect does not play anywhere like the silent or the ironclad.
Oh, man,
And
that's
some
crazy, yeah.
in some cases, it's these very slight turns. Like a very simple example is that the Ironclad gets a lot of cards or has a greater chance of getting strength boosting abilities, while the
Yeah,
Silent has a greater chance of getting more defensive boosting abilities.
yeah.
And as you said, like the enemies themselves, they're not designed specifically to say this enemy is the Ironclad's worst nightmare. It's more this enemy is designed to punish a deck that only plays, very high energy cost cards. This enemy is designed to punish a deck that plays a lot of low cost cards. Like there's an enemy in Biome 2 that every time you hit them, it gains a shield per turn. So your
Or the thorns effect, where anytime I hit them, like
yes.
if I hit you with 21-point hits, I'm going to take 23-point hits.
Yes. I know. So again, like I think we just keep going back to this thought, but this is a very elegant game. I think it's a good thing that we picked as kind of like our first game. Like there's a lot that just really works with Slay the Spire that I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about why it works this way.
And its validity and its well-constructed nature persists through so many hours of gameplay, and it's not like the gameplay stays the same and just grows; it evolves, right? There's like again, even in the progression, it's multiple systems that hand off to each other, so you don't get exhausted with any one piece of it as it moves forward. You're like, I'm totally done with the Ironclad, so I start playing the Silent, which just made me totally not done with
Yeah,
playing
and
the
then you go
Ironclad.
back.
And then it's like I get really good at figuring out the defects orb stuff, and then I go back to the Ironclad, and it makes me remember that some of the card basics I was just ignoring and just chasing these cool power card configurations so that I can create these big explosions. And then after playing the Ironclad some more, I jump back into playing the defect. It polishes up my kind of core attack and defense rhythm a little bit better, and I get better results. And it's like as I master these characters and unlock everything, I start realizing I should be exploring strategies that might rely on some of those expensive colorless cards. And I'm going to give it a shot now because I can think those thoughts now. Before
Yeah.
I couldn't have even thought that thought. It's like, what is it? Oh gosh, it's kind of a pastel rainbow looking card. And I
The
think it's
one
a
that
three
lets
point.
you play like any cards, or you can start drawing rewards from the other classes.
Something like that. There's one of these cards, and it just starts spewing cards. Like, any of those cards that you get to choose amongst three cards, and whatever you choose will be zero cost, for example, right? Those often are pretty tasty. Even more nice are the ones like you get 5 cards. They all cost 0, but they get thrown into your deck somewhere.
Yeah.
But you keep doing that. Next thing you know, you have infinite
Yeah.
cards in those decks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to be fair, I think they exhaust if you use them, right?
Yeah, but again, like that potential just really grows the more you play, and like we've said before, once you beat the game the first time, you're no longer really concerning yourself with winning. It's more about, okay, what crazy combination can I come up with now? I already know how the game ends. It's now about how does this middle play out. But
Yeah,
I
middle
think,
and it plays out in so many different ways too, right?
mm-hmm,
You're in fact the middle game is where I always mess up.
yep. But we could sit here for like the next 2 to 3 hours, I think, gushing on this game. So here's the final point that I want to bring up, and then we will wrap things up. Because we don't want this to turn to like 2 to 3 hours per episode.
Sure, sure, yeah, it's totally time.
But there is one last thing that I want to discuss. I think this is very important, especially when we talk about design analysis. Are there any areas where you feel the game could have done better, or there are any issues that you had with it? And the point that I want to kind of touch on, again, this is something that I think could be debatable, is like we said, as you go up and up the ascension level, RNG becomes definitely more of a factor. When you're trying to beat the game at like the highest ascension, it's no longer about your skill at that point. At that level, you need the game to be giving you the good rewards, or you're not going to be able to win. And it kind of feels like it almost takes on a different feel to it compared to the lower levels.
Yeah, and I didn't get deep enough into the game, but
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine, like all I know, I don't know how all developers would approach it.
Mm-hmm.
I know many, and we generally tend to approach it in a similar fashion. In that the way we would like if our system can support higher difficulty, we know that there are players out there that want that higher difficulty, and so we make it available, and then we do the best we can to make it so the game is reasonable in those difficulty settings.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll get, we might get distorted attitudes about what makes sense or what doesn't at the extremities of this difficulty. um, you know, at like Ascension level 3 where I've gotten, it's like it's harder, but it's just better harder. And it's really
Mm-hmm.
starting to challenge my more advanced strategies. I think at
Mm-hmm.
the extremities, it kind of starts taking must, right? The assumption
Mm-hmm.
is it takes on some of the classic roguelike elements of high difficulty settings where no chance. This beginning thing, a couple things need to happen, and if those things don't happen, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And that the players who like really pump a lot of time in that difficulty setting, they just immediately give up. They're just like,
Yep.
nope, not happening this time. And to be fair, they didn't do that at first, right? They learned the ropes of that degree of difficulty. And is it fair becomes a question. Um, I don't think that's the right question to ask, right? The question to ask is how
Mm-hmm.
many players get pushed out of continuing down that difficulty because of choices that are outside of their control, and how many
Mm-hmm.
players stick with it because it's outside of their control.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, whichever of those groups is bigger, by the way, should be the one you design into.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, it's always tricky with these kinds of games, with just how far do you go up kind of the expert path. Like, I think for me, I don't know if I'll ever be able to get to Ascension level 20 with any character. But
Is that the
again,
maximum?
yeah, I think it's
Okay.
20 at the moment, although I think there are like additional things you can do to make things harder. But again, I think the game works at like it works at multiple skill levels, and not a lot of games can really boast that.
Well, I really like how, like, when you do the smart job with your difficulty, you don't necessarily have difficulty settings, right? What
Mm-hmm.
you have is a path into your space, and a player can just kind of walk the path that works for them. And
Mm-hmm.
that right over there, there's something tasty, but if it's intimidating for you as a player.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not, you go and you get the tasty thing, and you keep getting more tasty
Mm-hmm.
things, and it keeps getting harder until you're like, oh, I'm intimidated by that next thing. Maybe I'll wait before I go there, or maybe I've had enough of the escalation in this game, and I'll just hang out right here until I play it out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's nice. It's well done because it is actually quite easy to kind of dwell in your chosen difficulty setting. Although to be fair, I'm definitely trying to shoot towards the completion of fourth chapter with each of the
Yes.
characters eventually. Um, as I wouldn't say I'm the most hardcore of rogue-like players, and even though I might be ultimately very much a fan of high difficulty and like designing into high difficulty and in a very limited number of types of games. play them until I have sufficient skill to kind of accommodate that difficulty. I'm not necessarily a hard games kind of player.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe part of it is just that since I've been playing games from since like the late 70s, I guess you can't not be a hard games player in some respects because of that, because there was no such thing. I mean, I am able to play all of Super Ghouls and Ghosts in a single life, all the way through to the second boss and
Yeah.
complete it without thinking twice. Well, I don't know if I could do it today, but I was able to do it 25 years ago.
Well, and I can play Contra without needing to use the Konami code, so
Yeah,
at least I have
nice,
some
totally.
level there.
Definitely capable of doing that as well. Contra, oh man.
Yeah.
I mean, just the super low resolution NES graphics. That doesn't. My memory of them is not that low resolution, by the way.
All right, but I think with that, let's wrap things up because again, we can with two guys who like to talk about game design, we can be here for who knows how many hours. Again, the audience they love it, but our voices, or at least I know my voice, will die eventually.
Totally, yeah. And so I'll have a closing statement. My
Sure.
closing statement is I am very impressed by Slay the Spire. How clean production value is all very high, well polished experience, so few errors, and I it's like playing the game as much as I did taught me a ton about what the mind state of card game players is at a deeper core. Because obviously the designer here, or the designers of this game, they took all of the mechanics of what deck building is for them, like playing Magic or whatever, which I'm not a big player of, and and pulled it apart into tiny little pieces so I, as a different kind of gamer, could build my deck bit by bit. And in the process of doing that over and over and over again to the tune of at least 50 or so hours, I gained a ton of insight about what the thought process would or should be, perhaps, with respect to deck building games.
Yeah. And if we ever get them on for our cast, we need to ask them, like, if anyone on the team either had experience at high level deck building games or playing them, like, as like a high level competitor, because you can definitely see, like, the design of Slay the Spire. It definitely shows that somebody on that team understood deck building games, not only from how they work, but how you can also break that design, as you said, into these various sub aspects that again all
They have to.
coalesce.
They
Yes.
have to know. In fact, oh, check this out. Here, I'll read to you the little like one sentence bios on
Mm-hmm.
their website. Anthony Giovanetti. Favorite games: Planescape Torment, Netrunner, Half-Life 2. Anthony grew up in Seattle area where he has been a lifetime card player, becoming obsessed with Android Netrunner when it was released in
Mm-hmm.
2012. He created and now maintains the largest Netrunner fan site and forum. And he conceptualized Slay the Spire, leads the design effort, and handles all the boring business stuff. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other guy, well, another one is born in San Francisco, California, been in Washington for 20 plus years. First call his hometown, grew up sketching and doodling, pursued computer science university, so coder artist. Developed some small games with Anthony while juggling game tester job at comp sci classes. He made the Slay the Spire prototype. And
Mm-hmm.
then there is another programmer, a Danielle Jenkins, um, worn many hats. And then there is a Jake Rabinovitz. Looks like playtesting metrics, bug fixing, some production stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Thousands of hours of playtesting. So it sounds
Oh, I
like
bet.
led by an absolute card game fanatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure as a group they were able to just like it's the key. The key is, as a group, it doesn't matter what they knew before, because this result is indicative of an effective disassembling of
Mm-hmm.
an existing experience, right?
Yep. And I think that is a good point to end on. So the developers of Slay the Spire are watching this. Again, congratulations on the game. We love it. The fans love it. And you guys did an amazing job with its design, for sure.
And I mean, its success totally shows.
Yep. So with that, we're going to wrap up this very first episode. This cast is going to be getting posted as soon as it's on encoding, because I want to hear from the people here. What do you think of this idea, this kind of video game of the month club? And again, if we can, we need to come with a catchier title. So if you have any suggestions for either a title for this show or for games for us to tackle in upcoming episodes, let us know in the comments below. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBeister. We have our Discord and Patreon link down below. Patreon subscribers always help keep things going, so if you are able, be sure to check that out. And for you, Tomo, what are the best places people can find out about you or the games that you are working on?
So I'm working on a game called Epic Tavern, and I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Hyperkinetic Studios. You can find us on Discord at discord.gg/Epic Tavern, and on Twitter and on Twitch. I think we are at Epic Tavern and Epic Tavern. And we're more than happy to talk about game development, game design, and storytelling. And in our specific case, we're disassembling storytelling rather than maybe card games like Slay the Spire. Thank you guys for having me, and hope to see you guys next time.
All right. So with that said, we're going to wrap things up. Everyone enjoy your self-imposed, or I guess not so much self-imposed quarantine. Play lots of video games, and we'll be back for another episode of this, ideally in a month's time, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Have a great rest of your night, folks, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye, guys.